Well, it's honestly a little bit surprising that we haven't had any new live Yes albums, but on the other hand, it's also surprising that we're getting so much as we are. And, yeah, let's dive into the next one, I guess.
I see no good people turn their heads each day so satisfied. I'm on my way.
The Royal Affair Tour live in Las Vegas by Yes. So, Yes. Oh boy, I guess we don't even need to have a proper introduction of Yes. Prague legends of Yes from the 60s and 70s. They were one of the trailblazers of the progressive rock movement. They were one of the first to really normalize having longer stretches of songs and complex interplay between keyboards and guitars, harmonizing between John Anderson on lead vocals and Chris Squire on lead bass. I mean, these guys were a staple of my musical love, right? Like, they were the ones that really turned me on to progressive rock. They were the first band I ever saw live, way back in the early 2000s, and I was just blown away by what I was listening to. And so, yeah, here we come to the Royal Affair with only no real founding members are left in the band at this point. You know, it's kind of a hodgepodge Frankenstein monster group at this point, where really the only staple, because they're not even founding members, of Steve Howe and Alan White on drums. So Steve Howe on lead guitars and Alan White on drums. And I think even Alan isn't on the drums all the time. Like, there's also Jay Schellen, I think is how you pronounce his name, is also on drums on here. So I have a feeling Alan is probably taking a back seat every once in a while and allowing Jay to come to the forefront. Now, rounding off the band are individuals that have been with the band for quite a while. So at least we still have a number of their personalities to help round out quite a big, I don't want to say whole, but quite a big responsibility for those that are coming in. The first up is Jeff Downs on keyboards, and Jeff has been with the band pretty much since the early 80s when he came on with the rest of the Buggles to help produce Drama. And he's on keyboards on this one, and I mean, the keyboard slot has been opened way too often, right? So, like, at this point, it's almost like who's filling the shoes of Rick Wakeman? I know that they've got a lot of really, really great shoes that have come before and after. And I will admit, like, I always enjoyed Jeff's playing. His more atmospheric, fun aspect that he brought to the band, especially on tracks like Tempest Fugit and Machine Messiah. And at least we have Tempest Fugit on this track list to kind of let Jeff show why he was filling in the shoes of Rick Wakeman. Also rounding off is Billy Sherwood on bass and vocals, and Billy was with Chris back in the 80s when, you know, John Anderson was doing the whole Anderson, Wakeman, Bruford, and Howe outfit and kind of like left Chris off to the side, which, I don't know, I still feel a little bit of a sting there, even though Anderson, Wakeman, Bruford, and Howe was really fun. You know, I still feel for my man of Chris, because Chris is one of my favorite bass players. And specifically what I love about Chris, not only his brilliant and beautiful bass work, but his ability to harmonize with John. And so I feel like the dynamic duo that was Chris and John was a little bit lost on that project. Talking about Anderson, Wakeman, Bruford, and Howe. That's a fun band to continue to say. But Billy came in near that like late 80s, early 90s, and he was the second half of Chris in the whole Union thing, right? Because Chris is one of the only members that is pretty much the only constant within the band's runtime, except of his untimely passing a couple of years ago. So unfortunately, Chris isn't able to be with us at this time. Billy does a good job of coming in and bringing his own personality while still honoring everything that Chris has done. Now, he's still not quite as good of a vocalist as Chris, and he doesn't quite have that same amazing tempo mastery that was the bass line that Chris had, but Billy does a good job of filling his shoes. Now, rounding us all off is John Davison on lead vocals. The man sounds exactly like John Anderson. He really does. There was a number of times when I had to remind myself that who I was listening to wasn't necessarily John Anderson, and that just goes for John, right? Like, John was on Heaven and Earth, the last studio album, if we're not including that big massive thing that was released a couple years ago, which was From a Page, which was mainly live stuff and then a few studio stuffs. But the last actual thing of Heaven and Earth, released in 2014, that's where John comes in and does a pretty good job. Like, John Davison did a fairly well job of mastering those high pitches and fun aspect that John Anderson brought to the band. So, all that being said and done, what do we actually have on this? I mean, this album, if we're going on Prog Archives, is the 21st live studio album. There's a lot of live studio albums that we have from Yes, and at this point I almost feel like we don't need any more, especially with the quality that's coming on here. Like nothing is coming to the same brilliance that we had probably since Symphonic Live, released in 2009, over 10 years ago. And before that, it was Keys to Ascensions 1 and 2. Those really were the last brilliant, amazing works live of Yes, because one of the things I love about a Yes live project is capturing that raw energy, that blast of creative outpour, and trying to hold on to this rampaging musical stylings of Yes. Their ability to rein in and control such chaotic energy was one of the things that I loved about a live performance, and that's going right back to the 1973 of Yes songs. I also still, to this day, love Yes shows released in 1980, but I mean, my favorites are still Keys to Ascension 1 and 2, as well as Symphonic Live. Now, since then, they've put out some less than stellar ones. Probably the last one of the bunch that I actually enjoyed was In the Present, live from Leon, released in 2011. The thing about Yes, especially now in their twilight years, is that lack of energy that is really needed to capture a lot of these really energetic tracks. There's nothing there. It's very bland. It feels like they're almost on autopilot, but worse, because if it was on autopilot, they would at least match the energy that the studio albums needed. Here, it feels like the tempo is so slowed down that it's in a catatonic state, and this was something that was especially found within topographic drama. Here, it feels like it's like, just let the beast die already. Like, I'm almost just yelling at the band, please, just put you guys out of your misery and just stop. There were a few points on this album that I thought that they were actually onto something smart. You know, if in this twilight years they weren't trying to do some of their big hits and trying some smaller tracks, some of those tracks that play to the strengths of an older playing style, right? Like they have Going for the One from that album, Going for the One, when really they should have been playing either Wondrous Stories or Turn of the Century, the smaller tracks off of that album. If they were playing Wondrous Stories, they at least can match the energy that is found on that track, and they could elevate it with the mastery and skill of a master of the craft up to this point in their career. Instead, they decided to go for Going for the One, which needs a lot more energy for that final punch at the end. And it just feels like somebody's like wavering, ready to collapse. They were able to match the tempo for Tempest Fugit, and I think a lot of that had to do with probably Jay coming on the drums and helping Alan out a little bit in that sense. Another track that I feel like they were really smart in playing was Onward. Onward being a really mellow, more emotional track. And I feel like if they had brought more tracks like that out of the woodworks, like something from The Ladder or something from Magnification, that doesn't require these massive shredding, bombastic drumming and insane bass playing, they could have had a really intimate moment. And I mean, this brings me to one of the biggest issues that I have with this album is within the set list of the Las Vegas show, they actually had Gates of Beryllium being the third last track, with Imagine being the first encore and Starship Trooper being the last encore. And I'm torn, right? Because on the one hand, I'm very saddened that they left Gates of Beryllium off. But on the other hand, I can already almost tell you what it would sound like based on all the other tracks on the set list. And I don't know if I really want to hear that. I would love to hear Soon, the final piece of the Gates of Beryllium. I would have loved to hear that in its singularity form, because again, it's slower, it's much more emotive, it has a lot more of that emotion that I think the band can really bring forth. But everything that came before that, it needs a lot of that power. It needs a lot of that oomph. And we really haven't had that since the early 2000s. And we're already like almost 20 years past that mark at this point. And so, yeah, some of the other tracks on here, like Siberian Katru, is not good, especially with the energy that's needed for that. Same with Roundabout. I've seen All Good People actually matches the energy that's needed, but again, it feels very lifeless. It feels very cut off at the legs in that sense. And even Starship Trooper, when we get to that final build-up at the end of this piece, I was really hoping for some really good bottom that we had on this. And Billy Sherwood's able to really bring the bass line on here. But the interplay between Jeff Downs and Steve Howe with that kind of call and answer is not found. It's basically just Steve Howe on the guitar. And I understand that we're not going to have, the Keys to Ascension build up on that. And I get it, where there's that interplay between Steve and I want to say it was Rick Wakeman. I get it. I know that that's not going to happen anymore. But I would have liked to see a little bit of that playoff between one another, especially since Starship Trooper's on pretty much every single one of the live albums. And so I want to hear something different. And yeah, it wasn't really there. Other than that, we have America, which is the Paul Simon cover. This was the one that came off of the B-side from, I believe it was Close to the Edge, either Close to the Edge or Fragile. I think it was Fragile, actually. And I love that cover. I think that they were able to match the energy very well on this. But again, it's still very lifeless. And the one that kind of surprised me was the John Lennon cover of Imagine. It was fine, but again, kind of lifeless at this point. So yeah, that's about it. I guess like the album opens up with No Opportunity Necessary, No Experience Needed, a Richie Havens cover, which I've never heard before, and the boys are able to do something nice with it. So in the end, the Royal Affair tour live in Las Vegas is a bit of a mess, but I'm not surprised. It's a little bit better than what I was expecting, but the bar is set so low you can trip over it. If this is really your first introduction to the band, you're not going to be all that disappointed, but I would steer you guys clear away from this by miles. I would either start with Symphonic Live, Keys to Ascensions 1 and 2, and Yes Shows and Yes Songs. Like, those are your staple Yes Live projects. You don't need to touch this. This one is for those who have a lot of money that is just loving Yes and will buy anything that Yes puts out. I am not one of those. I love Yes, but I do not have an endless pocket of money. I'm just going to keep streaming it on services that I already pay for. I'm not going to shell out any more money to actually get this in physical format. Honestly, at the end of the day, this one's a skip. They've already put out way too many live albums at this point in their career. I don't think it's needed. Yeah, this is a skip for me. Don't bother with it. If you really want to listen to it, go for it, but if you miss out on it, you're not missing anything that hasn't already been heard before. So there you go. That's the Royal Affair Tour live in Las Vegas by Yes. What did you guys think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, let me know by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.